Hey, how's it going?
Hey there. Hi. So you had this great discussion with Sam Harris on your show.
Yeah.
And Harris raised an issue in the relationship between ignoring certain doctrinal text, right? And yet still believing in ideas like revelation. Right?
Yes.
My question is, if you truly believe in the supernatural side of monotheism, why is it okay to perform, as you described in Judaism, an ongoing dialectic?
Yes.
Right? Over time and pick and believe only certain pieces of doctrine when you realize, oh wait, the original parts we're omitting were directly from an omniscient being.
Right. Okay. So,
How do you get your mind around
sure.
that?
So the answer that I gave Sam Harris is that the omniscient being, in this case God, gave the perspective of Judaism has always been the omniscient being gave us flawed human beings this book. This book was directed at a certain time and at a certain place, right? The people who were living 3,000 years ago didn't have the same education and values, the same evidence, the same scientific knowledge, the same 3,000 years of development we've had since Sinai. And so God was talking to specific people at a specific time. So a lot of the commandments are specifically directed at converting people away from more primitive practices toward less primitive practices. So to take an example, animal sacrifices are now, we look at them and we go, that's really primitive, that's pretty terrible, right? So the idea, Maimonides puts this forth, and he's writing this in 1100. The idea that Maimonides puts forth is that there were pagan practices in which animals were slaughtered on behalf of pagan gods, and the idea was that you were sort of appeasing these gods, and that this was supposed to be, and that this was the use of animal sacrifices for perverse purposes. People weren't willing to give up those perverse purposes at the time. God knew that, and so God converted the use of those purposes to the worship of him, for example. And then we have to apply, this is where Judaism is really an interesting religion, not to stump for my own religion, but I'm a fan. What Judaism, the part of Judaism that makes it so interesting is that Judaism doesn't just say that we were given revelation at Sinai on the written side. It says there was also something called the oral Torah, the Mishnah. Okay, and that was the explanation that people had of the Torah at the time, meaning that there's an entire common law tradition in Judaism that stretches directly from Sinai and is codified in the Talmud, which is written 700 CE, 500, 700 CE, and it's legitimately like 73 volumes of commentary on the written Torah. Like I study it every day, actually, and so here's the point: God didn't just say to human beings, "Here's the law. I mean exactly what I say forever on these areas without regard to what human beings are." God injected an enzyme into human development. That enzyme was, in my view, revelation, and without that enzyme, there is no catalyst for Western civilization. There are certain principles that are different in Western civilization than in other places in the world. And human beings, using their reason and logic, get to apply eternal principles to new circumstances and new evidence over time. The answer that the question Sam never answered is, why here? Why is the West so great? So Sam never, if revelation is all just bunk, right? If it's all just evolutionary development of the mind and searching for the most, most flourishing for the most people and all this stuff, then why is Western civilization different? Because it obviously and eminently is quite different.
Right, the Judeo-Christian ethic argument, right?
Right.
But I'm trying to focus more on the spirituality side, because it seems like you acknowledged, right, there are parts that you're leaving out in even your beliefs, right? Most modern Judeo-Christian.
Well, there are parts that are directed at changing human nature, and there are parts that are directed at unchanging human nature.
Would you argue, though, so your argument is that essentially this deity put in parts and essentially duped us, said, okay, you can leave those out eventually?
No, my argument is that anything I say to you right now as a human being inherently is going to be different than it would be if I directed it to your descendants 2,000 years in the future, because that's how human language works. There is no way to convey a written document or language to any human being without being confined by the context of the time in which people live. That's true of any document, it's true of any conversation. You literally cannot do it any other way. So I'm not sure, like, you're asking of God an impossibility, which is to give a moral system that is completely unfit for a people at the time that he gave it. If God gave us the Torah now, I assume that it would look a lot more like the development of Western civilization than it did when it was given to a bunch of primitives and primitive nomads living in the desert.
Yeah. I don't doubt your argument about developing our morals. I totally
Yeah.
agree with that. What I'm doubting is the idea of a deity, believing in literally
Right,
God
and the argument for a deity and the argument for revelation is a long one. I have an entire book coming out about it next year. But the basic idea is that Sam uses all the building blocks of Western civilization that are based on a Judeo-Christian value system and revelation and a God that exists outside of time and a directional nature to the creation of the world, a logic to the nature of the world. He uses all those arguments, gets rid of God, and then expects the edifice not to crumble. And I don't think it's possible to uphold that edifice without those foundational building blocks that include the idea of an ordered universe created by a loving God.
Thank you.
Thanks.